Awesome, thanks. I haven't presented a ton on Zoom, but I'm going to try to share my screen so you can see. Right? Is that how you have people doing it? Yeah, okay. Okay. This is the one I want. Hold on. Let me see. Jamie, I'll look for a heads up to make sure that you can't. If I have this open, can you see my like note thing right here?
Nope.
Okay.
Just the presentation.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So I took some notes. Hopefully, like I tried to anticipate some questions that might come up. So I'll just have that in the background. Pretty much as Jamie mentioned, my name is Bri Degone. My background in Javelin is kind of short and sweet. I threw for Leavitt. I graduated in 2014, and I didn't pick up a Javelin until I believe end of my sophomore, beginning of junior year. So I threw for about 2 years in high school before I went on to the University of Maine, where I threw an additional 3 years. So I have 5 years of competition in Javelin, graduated recently in 2018, and then I was anticipating to coach primarily Javelin at Leavitt this spring, but COVID had other plans for that. So my coaching experience is more or less kind of coaching myself. I've done a lot, kind of both working with my coach at the University of Maine and some independent research to improve my own skills, but I've also worked individually with a few high school and college level athletes. I will put out there that a lot of the information that I'm talking about today comes directly from my coach at UMaine. His name is Gerhard Skal. He is from Europe, so a lot of his European techniques is kind of what I coined as my own through the years of doing Javelin. And over 3 seasons, it increased my personal throw 30 feet. So they might not work for everybody, but it worked well for me. And then the other disclaimer I have is I throw left-handed. So I've gone through this presentation with like a fine tooth comb to switch that for a right-handed athlete. But if I say anything, like if I refer to my left or my right and you think it should be the other way, just like, jump in for clarity. Because I know most athletes are right-handed. So to get right into it, if I were to summarize a successful Javelin throw, I would have 3 things that come to mind. A throw needs to be technically sound. You need to be able to have a strong body during your throw and also an explosive release. So that's kind of how I've laid out my presentation today. First and foremost, I want people to learn the technique of throwing a javelin correctly, and then some workouts for like javelin strength. And then I also added ways to gain explosiveness into your release. So the first piece, and this is definitely like the bulk of the information, is the technical side. Learning how to throw a javelin can definitely be somewhat challenging, but it's essential to know the start to finish approach for a successful throw. So I'm going to break that down into 4 phases today. And what I had kind of planned to do is we'll stop after the technical portion for questions before moving into the strength and explosiveness. So the first piece that a lot of people may not know is there are different types of javelins. So for competition, men's javelins have to be between 8.6 and 8.10 and weigh about 800 grams. And for women, it's 7.3 to 7.7 and weigh about 600 grams. So those are the requirements put on for high school athletes. However, there are different styles that can work better or worse depending on how athletes throw in competition. So the first different type that both of which are allowed would be headwinds and tailwind javelin tips. So you can see, oops, I don't know if you can see that, sorry. You can see at the bottom the 2 different types of tips, which you've probably seen in your javelin equipment shed before. I think most high schools, and I might be speaking out of place here, I believe most high schools have both. So the headwind javelins have a stream, that's the one on the left. It has a streamlined tip, and it's designed to help cut through the wind. So this tip, because of its small surface area, it will have self-correcting characteristics when a thrower misses the point. So this will add value to a missed throw. This style tip is ideal for power throwers who lack their perfect technique but make up for it with strength and torque. So oftentimes when you have a new beginning thrower who's just strong and they kind of just run and chuck their javelin, starting with a headwind tip will allow for the most success with the level they're at. The tailwind jav is the thicker, more blunted tip, and this increases surface area in front of the javelin. When a thrower hits through the point with a tailwind tip javelin, it mimics the old style javelins before they did the recent switch in the late 90s. I guess that's not recent anymore, but the switch in the 90s. And this will allow for, when it's thrown through the point, for the javelin to kind of float in flight and get greater distances. Opposite of the headwind, the tailwind tip is ideal for finesse throwers who may lack output of power, but have a really high technical level, their technique is sound, and they can hit that point more often than not. So since the javelin is such a long implement, but it's light, the wind has a great effect on its flight. So when you know that the wind conditions are gonna be suboptimal, depending on which conditions you have, it might be a good idea to switch the tip you're using. So when wind conditions, when you have headwinds, a sharper, narrower tip like the headwind tip jab will fly better. And then if you have a tailwind, then a thick point is more effective. So depending on how the athlete throws or what the wind conditions are, which tip you choose can greatly impact your throw. The other thing that changes your style of the javelin is a javelin rating. So these are the most important part of determining what javelin to use. So the javelin rating is a numerical scale in meters that basically says how stiff or forgiving the javelin is. So when a thrower releases a javelin, the javelin bends and somewhat warps in the air, and the amount of the bend affects the javelin rating. So ratings vary between 35 meters and 100 meters. In high school level and most college levels, 100 meters isn't often used, but a lower rating is the best type of javelin for beginning, as it adjusts to the thrower's current throwing style. So when a beginner's first learning, again, their form probably isn't structurally sound. So a low rating will help the javelin fly better through the air and decrease the amount of stress on the elbow. So this kind of has two purposes. The jav kind of auto corrects to the best of its ability and minimizes injury to the athlete. And then when athletes become more advanced, going toward a higher rating will increase the stiffness of the javelin. This will, if a throw is thrown incorrectly, the javelin will do two things. It won't have that autocorrect feature, so it will kind of fly off in whatever direction that the tip is traveling, and it's also more prone to elbow injury. So a higher rated jab is great for advanced because when it's thrown properly, it will glide across the air and increase distance and travel a lot farther than the lower rating javelins. So I did put on the slide for beginners, which at high school levels, this is typically the javelins we're using. For men, that's 50 to 60 meters. For women, that's 35 to 40 meters. And then as your throwers become more advanced, you can kind of up that rating. And I do want to kind of put out there that using a 35 meter javelin doesn't mean you have to be throwing 35 meters. It's just saying that's where the javelin will kind of plateau. So you never want to be capable of throwing 50 meters and using a 35 meter javelin. And just because I know most high schools use feet, 35 meters is, that's about 110, 115. So again, it's like pretty high up at the high school level. But if you have an athlete who's more advanced, you can up the rating of their javelin. So then after the style of javelin is selected, there's also 3 different grips that athletes can use. The most important point of the grip of the javelin is that all athletes have a strong, stable grip, and it must remain firm behind the ledge made by the binding. So the ledge is just where that rope cord stops. The javelin for all 3 grips will run down the length of the palm, and the fingers will press firmly on the javelin to produce a natural spin when it's released. So that's the goal, regardless of the grip an athlete chooses. The 3 different types, the American grip, the Finnish grip, and the fork grip, or the V grip, as some people call it, can be shown to the left, but I'm going to go through kind of the pros and cons of all 3 of those. So the American grip, that's the first option. I personally believe that if you have a beginner or even more advanced, the American grip is the best option. So this is when the cord is gripped between the thumb and the index finger. And again, it's on the ledge of the handle. It feels awkward at first, but it gives the beginner the advantage of the grip, and it allows for better flight of the javelin. So you're more or less pinching the end of the cord or the handle with your index and thumb finger. But you can see the athlete above is doing that. His fingers are relatively loose, but you can see that the cord stops on his index finger. The next one is the Finnish grip. So the image above, it's a little hard to see, but you can see that the athlete throwing there has his index finger beyond the grip, and it's actually the thumb and the middle finger that's at the ledge of the binding. The index finger is on the back half of the javelin, and it's acting as support to stabilize the javelin more. This grip is used by more experienced throwers. It's very often seen in Europeans during high-end events, whether that's like the Olympics or other very advanced throwing competitions. And it's not a great grip style to begin with, as oftentimes it's more of a distraction for throwers than the value added. So at a high school level, I still recommend the American grip over the Finnish. And the last grip, this is straying people away from this one as much as possible is kind of the only reason I have it here. This grip is often used to introduce javelin because it's similar to holding a baseball, so it's familiar to a lot of athletes who haven't necessarily worked with a javelin before. Like I said, it's good for beginners. It emphasizes the support of the palm as it runs directly through the center of the palm. But I don't recommend this because the javelin runs down the center of the palm, you have a lot of wrist mobility still. When we get further into the technique, I'll walk you through the importance of having a firm and stable wrist. So because there's a lot of wrist mobility here, oftentimes beginners will drop their wrist right before release, and that will result in the javelin traveling in unpredictable ways. So although a lot of beginners will lean towards this one, as coaches, I would highly recommend straying them from this as much as possible. You can see from my image that it's just a guy showing the fork grip. I searched and searched and searched to find someone throwing with a fork grip hold, and it's next to impossible. So a good rule of thumb is if no professional athletes are doing it, then it's probably not a very valuable thing for high schoolers to use. So the next portion, now that you picked a javelin, you're holding the javelin, we're gonna walk through the actual technique. I have this video here of a German Olympian. He is throwing it in slow motion. So for those of you who aren't super familiar with all the different stages of throwing a javelin, it is somewhat overwhelming to see start to finish. So I'm gonna show the video, and then I've broken it down into 4 phases. Awesome. So the first phase is the approach. I'm going to try to pause the video as I kind of walk through these. But this is here when he is just running straight forward. The second phase, which he's kind of began to do, is the withdrawal of the javelin itself, which is right there. Phase 3 is the transition, otherwise known as crossovers usually. And then the last phase is the delivery, and that's the release of the javelin. So the first phase is the approach. This is a run-up that's about 5 to 7 steps. It's totally up to the athlete, how far or how many steps they want to take or how few steps they want to take. When the athlete is doing this, their body and their hips are facing toward the sector where they're going to release the javelin, so everything is facing forward. The elbow is bent at a 90-degree. Eyes are forward. The javelin is on the side of the head, about just a little above eye level. So the important parts of phase 1 for athletes is to focus on speed, to stay relaxed, and to keep the javelin absolutely still. Oftentimes when people first start working on this approach, their javelin almost pulses as they're running. So as they stride, the javelin's almost bouncing above their head. During their run, they should be accelerating, but through this acceleration, the javelin should remain at that level. So on this slide, I have taken a screenshot of a video. Vetter is another German Olympian. I use his pictures throughout most of the presentation, but if you watch his videos on YouTube, when you see his run up, the javelin remains perfectly still. So it is like slightly above eye level the entire time. So the next piece is the withdrawal phase of the javelin. So after those 5 to 7 steps are taken, you withdraw the javelin back. So in this movement, your hips shift slightly toward the javelin in the direction that your arm is pulling backwards. So instead of being directly forward toward the sector, you have shifted those slightly to the, trying to switch it for right-handed, to the right. And the javelin arm has pulled back into a straight position and it stays parallel with the shoulder. Another common mistake by beginners is when they pull back, they drop that arm lower, more toward their hip. So it's important in the withdrawal phase to raise, or not necessarily raise your hand, but keep your hand parallel with the shoulder. Another piece is the opposing arm. So the arm that's in front of Vetter's body bends and straightens in unison with running strides. So you can see here that it's bent at a 90-degree. And in the next video, or in the next clip, he will have it straightened. So as he runs, he's almost using that arm in like a marching motion to kind of generate power and keep his rhythm synchronized. During the withdrawal phase, the eyes should stay forward. Oftentimes when that javelin withdraws, athletes will look at the tip of their jav. It's important to keep your eyes locked throughout this whole motion on the throwing through the point. So you want to look out toward the sector, slightly angled upright, even as you withdraw the javelin. And then the third phase, I called it the transition. I have 2 different pieces of the transition. There's the crossovers, which we'll touch on first. The crossovers are oftentimes described to athletes as similar to the karaoke drill, as most athletes have done this drill before. However, I think sometimes when it's compared to that drill, there's a few mistakes that kind of get roped into it. The most important is during the crossover, when throwing a javelin, you are only crossing in the front. So if you're familiar with the karaoke drill, athletes will bring their front forward and then they'll put it behind them and forward and behind them. When you're doing the crossover in javelin, as you can see Vetter doing in this photo, his legs are only moving in front. So his trail leg will move over his lead leg. The other thing during this is knees should be slightly bent during the entire movement. Legs should never be stiff, and both legs are always engaged during this process. So my coach at the University of Maine always would yell push pull at me when I was competing. And what he meant by that is the back leg should be pushing or propelling the body forward, while the front leg is trying to pull the body forward. So none of these leg movements are just to get you closer to the line. Each and every step is deliberate and should be generating power as you go. So when the back foot pushes, the front foot should be pulling, and then that just continues throughout your entire crossover duration. Similar to the approach, how many crossovers you do is kind of up to the athlete. Typically, it could be about the same 5 to 7 crossovers before the final crossover, which we'll talk about next. But it's ultimately when the athlete feels comfortable and ready to release the javelin. The most important part about this, though, is whenever they figure out how many crossovers to take, they should consistently take that many, just to, again, really hone in on the rhythm of it and the consistency. And oops, before I go there, the arm continues. Oh, I can actually show this slide. So you can see, again, his arm is bent at a 90, and then here it straightens. So you're kind of just doing that motion with the opposing arm, and the eyes are continuing to look forward over that left shoulder. So the last piece of the transition, this is the final crossover. So it's referred to as the penultimate. I've heard people call it the crow hop, as that's a baseball term or softball term that a lot of athletes are familiar with. But again, making that reference to a crow hop motion kind of gives some misconceptions as to the proper way to do it. So to put it simply, a penultimate step is a glide before the actual throw. And this allows the athlete to utilize his or her speed and to better position themselves in the throw. So you've generated all of this power, but you need to glide or float, as a lot of coaches like to explain it. And while you're floating, you're turning your hips and you're pointing your feet and you're adjusting your body so you're in an optimal position to throw. So when this motion is executed correctly, it allows for all the speed and the power to transfer from the run up to the javelin itself. For right-handed throwers, this motion is a quick left, right, left. So you can see in this little clip art here that the athlete hops on their left foot, lands on their right, and then hits the left foot again. So some important lower body mechanics during this phase. I'll try to get a little pointer, maybe that'll help. So one thing that's very important and something that athletes do on accident is this foot right here. You want to make sure that you're not making a kicking motion. So because these athletes are entering the penultimate with so much power, oftentimes when they do that last crossover, this foot will end up kicking out here. So there's no benefit to raising that foot that high. Really, you are just losing power and your balance by doing so. So you're not necessarily going to fall, but you're trying. The whole purpose of this move is to get your center of gravity in the correct position to generate as much power as possible. So if you kick that foot too far forward, you're altering your center of balance, and it's just not as optimal as if you keep the foot low, as shown here. The other thing that some athletes try to do during this step is when they hear crow hop or a glide, they will end up on their final crossover, they'll end up jumping higher versus longer. So you should be trying to maximize the horizontal distance you're floating. The most optimal way to do this, your feet are almost skimming the surface of the track. There shouldn't be like an imaginary hurdle there that you're jumping over. You want to stay as low to the ground as possible. Again, that's just so if you think about kind of the physics behind it, you want all of your power moving in the forward direction or the horizontal direction. You don't want to lose any power by going up in that Y direction. And then you can see the athlete, after he makes it through the penultimate, is set up when both feet are landed in the optimized position to release the javelin. And so here's a video. I find it really hard to visualize the penultimate without seeing it in motion. So I'm just going to start this clip. It's pretty short, but you can watch how the rhythm of the run up changes at the very last crossover. Awesome. So I don't know if they pointed out the actual float there, but you can see that his final crossover is creating a lot more horizontal distance than those leading up to that movement. So the final step is the delivery, and this is a really critical piece because if you don't deliver or execute the actual release of the javelin correctly, then essentially everything you've done before this point has no value in the throw. So I've used 3 of Vetter's photos again. Personally, I just think it makes the most sense to use an Olympian who is structurally sound in his technique instead of using, a newer beginner when modeling it. So in the first photo, you can see that Vetter is landing from the penultimate. His trail leg has landed toe first, which is extremely important. And the distance from his trail leg to his lead leg is fully maximized. So both of his legs are as straight as they can be. He has gotten as much distance there as possible. His chest is open. His eyes are fixed on the point that he's going to throw the javelin through, and the javelin is angled in the same direction. So another thing that a lot of people, I've been using it freely when I say throwing through the point. If you're not familiar with that phrase, what that means is there's basically an imaginary circle almost in the air, and you are looking forward slightly above the tree line, and that's where you're aiming to throw the javelin. So research has shown that the optimal angle to release a javelin is 35 degrees. So that's when I say throwing through the point, it's that 35-degree angle that I'm implying. However, with the wind conditions, for your more advanced athletes, if there's a strong headwind, throwing a javelin at a flatter angle will be more beneficial for their throw. And then throwing into strong tailwinds, a steeper than usual angle is preferred. So optimal conditions, 35 degrees is the number to aim for, but depending on the wind conditions, that can fluctuate slightly too. So then in the next photo, you can see that his lead leg has landed, and this is called the block. The leg itself is completely straight, and the foot points forward. So you always want your front toes pointing in the direction that the javelin is going to go. When his foot hits, his trail foot twists, allowing his hips to snap forward. Again, this is kind of hard to show through still shots, but when he hits when his trail leg toes hit the ground, you want to rotate your angle outward and downward. So you're almost, in slow motion, it almost looks like you're breaking your ankle. But what you're doing is you're turning that foot so you're generating that power from your feet up through your legs into your hips. So by rotating that ankle, your hips are snapping forward. And once your hips snap forward, you want to continue transferring that power to your upper body. To do so, you can see that his opposite arm is pulling across the body and downward. So every movement, every muscle is used during this delivery because you are trying to get all the power generated from your toes on the track up through your fingertips as the javelin is released. So even the arm that is not holding the javelin is essentially just as important as the one holding the javelin, because by him almost making that like door opening motion. He's ripping his arm, elbow toward his hip, and this motion is opening up his chest and forcing almost like a catapult with the arm that's holding the javelin. So by pulling his body to the opposite side, his chest opens, and then you can see that his shoulder, elbow, and wrist just want to move in that in that direction as well. So his right arm holding the javelin, you can see, is leading with the elbow. The elbow should always be breaking that plane before the forearm does. So you always want to lead with your elbow. His wrist is remaining firm, and the javelin is released at the highest point, which is typically going to fall around the head of the athlete. So if the thrower properly accelerates through the entire throw, after their release, the athlete will fall over the block foot slightly. So that's a sign that the acceleration has stayed with the athlete the entire time. If the athlete can go through the run-up, the withdrawal, the crossovers, and then stop on that block foot and just stand there, then clearly all that power has been lost somewhere. So you can see in the last photo that he is falling over his foot because there's so much power that he has generated from his feet up through the javelin. After he releases it, his body has nowhere to go but forward as well. So that's a good thing. I don't think you'll necessarily see athletes in high school falling over per se, but it's so critical to make sure that they're not losing any of that speed or acceleration through their whole run up. So their fastest points should be that penultimate, and it should be an accelerated movement from the start of their run up all the way to the penultimate. There shouldn't be any speed loss there. The other piece that I do want to touch on is for beginners. This going through all these phases up through the delivery is or can be extremely overwhelming. So oftentimes as coaches, it's really important to start this process backwards. So working on athletes just at this phase, at the delivery, even if it's a standing motion, and this is a good place to start, so they understand that their block foot has to point forward, their opposing arm needs to pull opposite, their chest needs to open. If they get the concept of when delivering, they should be almost in the shape of a backward C, then they're ready to work backwards. So then you can teach them the penultimate, then you can teach them the crossovers, then you can teach them the run up, etc. So I believe this is a good place to stop, just because I think the technical component of throwing the javelin is a lot. The strength and the explosiveness is pretty quick, and that's off the runway work. So if people have questions, maybe now I can take those in terms of technique-based questions.
I have a question, Bri. So when you were showing Vetter, the distance in the release, the distance between his legs is incredible, and I think it's probably due to his strength and conditioning. That we're not looking for that shape in a high school athlete, are we? Or we're just looking for like the individual athlete's maximum?
Right. So obviously with his form, this is like best of the best. Like he's an Olympian, a gold medalist. So to expect a high school athlete to have that stretch, like me personally, I don't even think I can get my legs that far apart. So no, I don't expect that from high school. The most important pieces to take away is when you land out of the penultimate, your back foot hits first on the toes, and then your block leg comes as far forward as you can stretch with a straight leg. So some things that I see high school athletes do often is they either land heel first on the back leg, or they land into the block with a bent knee. And I think a lot of times that's, they're a little nervous with like, blowing a knee, tearing an ACL, whatever it may be. But landing with that straight leg is usually the safest way to land into a block, but it's also having that straight leg is how the power generates. So that's what I would say is most important with that image of him.
Sounds good.
Cool.
I have a question. This is Carolyn.
Yeah.
I I'm always surprised that like halfway through the season, someone goes out, picks up a javelin, and is really good at it. And if we could back that up to when we're starting indoors, is there some kind of a screening thing we could use to kind of identify potential javelin throwers?
Yeah, I have a couple in the upcoming slides. I have a few indoor training type exercises, and more as a target of like, wow, you'll be really good, or you should probably avoid javelin altogether. But yeah, because I think that's the hardest piece of throwing jav is you have such a limited time frame to actually throw it. Better at it.
Okay. And this is Carolyn. I have another question.
Yeah.
In one of the videos, you had someone, you were showing us the penultimate, but he kept fouling. Is that because too many blocks is kind of asking for injury?
Oftentimes, so that video was taken from a practice.
Right.
Oftentimes coaches just won't focus on the line. Like when I used to train, we just pretended the line wasn't there. So foul is what I would do during competition is I would start my run up from the foul line and run backwards, like toward the back of the runway, and then include so usually when you're in competition, you allow for that. So you fall forward before the line, but I'm guessing he was just fouling because, you know, it was just practice.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Awesome. Okay. So, I will keep going. And then if you have any questions that you think of, you can just stop me, but I'll save some time at the end as well. So the strength portion of it, again, as much as technique as is important, I think becoming strong in a javelin way is very vital to an optimal performance. So I have a few warm-ups, and I chose these warm-ups because they're all javelin based. So if you have a javelin, this is before practice throws or competition throws, there's some ways to warm up areas. This way you don't need to bring extra equipment with you for stretching. You can just use your implement as the actual stretching tool itself. Again, these are still shots, so if you need some clarity on what the athlete is actually doing here, I am more than willing to walk you through that. So the first one, he's just holding the javelin as wide. Well, he's starting wide and moving narrower each time, but he's ultimately bringing the javelin down to his hips in front of his body and then bringing it over his head and then toward the back side of his hips and just moving that over his head. You see a lot of athletes do this, and it's really just to increase shoulder mobility before throwing. Another warm-up that a lot of athletes do, the second one, he's holding the javelin in a similar width apart, but he's moving it almost in a rowing motion or canoeing motion around his head. So again, you might need to look these up because I wish I could model them with a javelin, but you can see that because he's moving it around his head, his shoulders are getting higher than in warm-up 1, but it's also, you know, loosening up those shoulders. The last one is the javelin is firmly in the ground. You reach up to the tail side of the javelin, and then you lean forward past the javelin, and this stretches kind of the underside of the shoulder, but also the underside of the shoulder, but the top of the shoulder as well. So it gets that like above and below area of the arm stretched and ready to go. And just because the javelin, throwing the javelin uses so many pieces and components of your body, it's really important to stretch or warm up all of them. So those are the shoulder warm-ups. There's a few back and chest warm-ups here. You can see that the first one, he has the javelin on his shoulders, and that one he's just like swinging it left and right as far as possible. So this will work pretty much all of the muscles up along the spine. And it also helps open your chest because your arms have to be so far back behind the javelin and behind your head. And the second stretch here, you can see he has it behind himself and he's stretching over the javelin. So this stretch really opens up the chest. It also works your lower back a little bit. And if done, you can see his lead leg is forward. You can also use this stretch to warm up your hips by kind of moving your hips in the javelin throwing motion that you would in competition. So again, gets the hips and the back and the chest moving. And lastly, these are some quick warm-ups for elbows and wrists. So in the first one, he's actually keeping his bicep stationary and he's rotating that javelin all the way behind his arm and then all the way forward. So it's making like a circular motion revolving around the bicep itself. The second one is a wrist motion, pretty common. You are just rotating the javelin around a fixed wrist or forearm really. So your wrist is rotating all the way one direction and then all the way the other direction. So those are just some good ones to do before actual throwing. And then, as I mentioned before, indoor training is really important, especially for Maine high school athletes because we get so little time to actually throw outside. So a few different ways, as Carolyn asked earlier, kind of how to pick up on if someone's going to be a good javelin thrower or not. I've seen a lot of workouts with indoor or turbo javelins if you have them. A javelin ball is the little red ball at the bottom of the screen. It has that little extension on it, and it acts more like that's where you would grip. It's kind of replicating the ledge of the cord on the actual handle of the javelin. Medicine ball workouts and using an indoor shot put are all really good tools and techniques to strength train during indoor season because all these can be used inside. I think when trying to aim to, I guess, pick up on someone's going to be skilled in javelin or not, if you have a turbo jav, just to have them throw it into a wall, or if your school has a screen, any type of mesh netting would, whether that's a 3 and 5 step or just a stationary movement, you can see what their release looks like. So this is a really good time to fine tune your release with a turbo jav or your steps working through your footing with ladders. What else? Medicine ball stuff, chest passes, slams, that's all more or less like strength training in an explosive way. So any of this is really useful when there's snow on the ground or the ground's still frozen, whatever it may be that's keeping athletes inside. Weight training for javelin throwers, there's a few main lifting techniques. Most of them involve Olympic type lifting. And I know a few probably are a little advanced for high school athletes. I don't think we're gonna have kids snatching and jerking, but for the more advanced lifters, this is kind of the list of the most beneficial lifts for throwing javelin. Squats, and that can be squats, regular squats, front squats, time squats, having band resisted squats, so having kids have that resistance and helping them gain some explosiveness there. Cleans and snatches, that can be from the floor, hang clean, split cleans and snatches. Deadlifting for speed is important. And then any types of presses and pullovers are really important. Just because, you know, throwing the javelin, like I said earlier, is one of those events where it's really your full body. So these few lifting exercises focus on your lower body, and a lot of them involve some calisthenic movements that work your whole body, like cleans and jerks. They're moving weight from the floor up through the upper body, whether that's overhead or to your chest. You're using all those muscle groups in there. So those are pretty useful. And then calisthenic exercises, anything body weight, core weight. This probably isn't super javelin specific, but using core focused workouts and back focused workouts are very important for javelin throwers. But working on anything that's kind of speed intensive, so box jumps for speed, rope work, sled work, those are really great at utilizing all of the muscles in the arms and all of the muscles in the legs in unison instead of isolating muscle groups. I guess that's a big takeaway for weightlifting for javelin throwers. There's no harm in doing isolated exercises, but the most benefit toward your throw will be weight training, using exercises that require multiple muscle groups. So not just like bicep curling, but squatting that involves like the shoulders and the legs and whatever it may be. Also, before I leave this slide, depending on the availability of the weight room, it's recommended that athletes are lifting 3 to 4 times a week for roughly an hour. That was our schedule at UMaine. Not overdoing it, obviously, but about an hour, 3 times a week. I wouldn't encourage any more than that because then it'll just exhaust them for throwing. So then I also wanted to include this in here. It wouldn't be a javelin presentation without it because injury prevention is so important. Most of you have probably heard about javelin throwers' elbow, and it's a very real thing. So I included a few best practices to prevent that as much as possible. The first and foremost is improving your technique. So oftentimes, a perfect throw shouldn't hurt an athlete's elbow or shoulder or wherever it might be hurting. If the form is completely like crystal clear, then they should feel great after the throw. If their elbow hurts, their shoulder hurts, their hips hurt, then the first thing should be looking at their technique, determining if something's off slightly and trying to improve it that way. Another good precaution is to allow for at least 30 minutes of full body warm up prior to throwing. Sometimes with high school meets, that's easier said than done. Depending on when javelins throw, you get off the bus and you're like running over there to start. But as much as possible, 30 minutes is critical. This warm up should include, your sweat should be on the whole warm up. On a day like today, that wouldn't be great, but it's really important to get the body warm, the heart pumping. If you're sweating, that's even better. But you want the body to be as warm as possible. So then those joints are just less likely to be injured during the release itself. You can do the warm-ups during this time. You can do the warm-ups with the javelin like I showed. You can also do some warm-ups with resistance bands if you have partners. Sometimes walking through the crossovers with a resistance band around your either your upper or lower legs being held by a partner is useful because this works your push-pull motion because you have some resistance against you. So it really makes you push and it really makes you pull if you want to move forward. Another thing is you can have a teammate or a coach hold a resistance band behind you and you're holding it as if it's a javelin and you're pulling it forward. So again, it's really forcing you to pull if you want that quote unquote javelin to move past you. So any resistance band work is good during this 30-minute time. Also, any type of just full body exercises, whether that's power skips are good here, even just some light jogs, just to get the body moving a little bit. And then the other piece, oops, I keep doing that, my apologies. The other piece is practicing routine recovery. A lot of athletes, whether they feel good after the throw or not, will just say, the throw's over, and not worry about the pain until, the next time they have to throw. But it's really important that in between every throw to cover your elbow and your upper body if possible. So whether it's cold, it's raining, even if it's like a nice sunny day, there's no harm in covering that elbow. So if you throw on I used to wear a compression sleeve. Athletes don't need to wear tight sleeves. You can see this athlete in the photo has KT tape on. That's an option as well. even ace wrapping it in between throws just to keep it really condensed and warm is important. You can take it off during your throws, but having that upper body covered when it's not throwing is really important. Also, stretching out your lower arms afterward. There's a bunch of great stretches for your forearms and that elbow area that you can do post throwing. Obviously, applying ice is always great, but just get in a routine to do that after every meet. And then fueling up and drinking water, that goes without saying, but that's useful for not just javelin throwers, but all athletes. So practicing those 3 steps, a javelin thrower's elbow is not always avoidable, but these are 3 steps that will help minimize that injury as much as possible. And then the last piece, explosiveness. It's really important to learn how to connect the pieces into a fast, fluid movement. I did add a little bit of explosive training off the runway, but the most important piece is to really go from the moment you start moving on the runway till the moment your javelin leaves your hand. That needs to just get faster and faster and faster. So the explosiveness that I'm really talking about for a successful throw is that you are accelerating the entire length of the runway. To work on building up athletes' explosiveness, some explosive warm-ups, like I mentioned before, doing power skips, med ball slams or passes. When you're really trying to move those arms or legs as fast as possible, resistant bands are great for that as well. Ladder footwork gets athletes moving, and then Olympic style lifting, like I mentioned earlier, those cleans and jerks, and even resistance band squats or time squats are all great. Just because throwing the javelin is more than just being a strong athlete, you need to be able to execute your strength as fast as possible because your speed is adding just as much importance as your strength. And then I did add, when you're on the runway, some important pieces. Breaking down your technique into the different phases is important. If you get comfortable with the penultimate and then you work your way backwards. So you get comfortable with the penultimate, you get comfortable with the crossovers, you get comfortable with the run up and the withdrawal. If you feel good about all those pieces independently, putting them into one fluid motion is going to be way easier than someone who still isn't comfortable with the whole movement. So if the whole thing is overwhelming, as I said before, focus on one, get that motion fluid, and then progressively add more steps to it. And then the other piece is recording throws is always useful. Being able to, from a coach or even the athlete looking at their own videos, a lot of athletes know what they're supposed to be doing. So getting apps to observe themselves in slow motion is great. I found it extremely beneficial because it's one thing to watch a professional, but it's another thing to watch yourself. And I think it really makes the difference between athletes who are good, that are going to be great if they can actually pinpoint what they're doing incorrectly. So Coach's Eye is a good app. I meant to add some more, but Huddle Technique is another good app. And there's probably several. Really, even just the iPhone camera, now that it does slow motion, is enough. But some of the coach-specific applications on iPhones or Androids, those allow you to actually draw and point out like what the athlete is doing right or wrong. So any type of slow motion videoing will help the athlete learn how to explode through their motion because they'll get more comfortable with it. So I believe that is it. Now that we've walked that whole thing, I did include this quick clip of Vetter because he's been throughout my whole presentation. But now that you know about the technique, the strength, and the explosiveness, again, this is not a high school level athlete by any means, but if you watch how quickly he comes into that penultimate, like that's the goal. So I'll just show this really quick and then I'll open it up for some more questions if there are any. Oh, maybe I will play this video, maybe not. All right, that's fine. it'll be here. Also, this is the name of it if you want to look it up on YouTube. Yeah, we'll just call it a day there, maybe. Okay. So that's a good place to stop. You can see he's ripped his arm fully over to his opposite hip. Oh my gosh. Ah! Okay. I think it's done. We'll just stop here. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
It doesn't look like there's any more questions, so I'm going to wrap this up. Bri, thank you so much. Your goal was to teach me something, and I tried to make mental notes of the things you did, and you absolutely did. I personally appreciate the wind stuff. I never even considered that. I thought wind was just bad luck. I didn't know there was anything we could do about it. I was like, whatever, wind. But that's
yeah.
What a great presentation. I am super thrilled that you were able to share that with us. I know I learned a ton. Oh, wait. Oh, we got some thank yous in the chat. Thank yous in the chat for you. Yeah, it was an excellent presentation. Thank you for doing it. And thank you, everyone, for coming. We will see you all later.